おかえり。遅かったね。フリーレン様、何ですかこのバカみたいにでかいハンバーグは。
何言ってんだよ。誕生日と言ったらこれだろ。師匠もプレゼントはくれなかったけど、誕生日のハンバーグだけは作ってくれたな。
どう？美味しい？
Hello there, welcome back to another episode of Anime with Alvin, where today we're going to be making the giant extra large Warriors Hamburg steak from Frieren, one of the best anime I think has come out in the recent months. Now for context, in the anime, there is a warrior named Stark, and Frieren, where probably the main character, is cooking him a very large Hamburg steak for his birthday. Even though it just seems like a giant slab of meat, there's actually a lot of meaning behind this dish. It was usually made by his master once a year for his birthday, although he didn't know why, but in a flashback it is revealed that the master cooks this dish for a warrior who has tried his best. So not only is this thing supposed to be quite delicious, but it seems to carry quite some sentimental value, which I think is really cool. With that being said, I am quite excited to make this large Hamburg steak, so let's get going. This episode is sponsored by Bombas, aka the world's most comfortable socks. And while they are comfy, the best part is that for each item purchased, one is donated. They've donated over 100 million articles of clothing so far across 50 states. So you're not just getting your new favorite pair of socks, you're helping Bombas donate some to someone else too. Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good. New customers get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/babish and use code babish20 at checkout. So Hamburg steak is kind of a Japanese fusion dish. Maybe it takes inspiration from Salisbury steak, where you take ground meat and kind of form it and grill it into a steak-like look without having actual expensive meat to cook. Kind of a way to use cheap meats to make something luxurious out of it. I decided to go with both beef and pork because these are some quite cheap cuts, both chuck roast and pork shoulder. First things first though, I'm going to go ahead and take the skin off of this pork shoulder. I'm going to set aside that just to take home because I like eating pork skin and cooking it a certain way. That's another episode. This is roughly 3 pounds of pork shoulder, and I'm going to take the meat and just cut that into little chunks and place that on a tray lined with some parchment paper. Then I'm going to take roughly 3 pounds of this chuck roast as well. Go ahead and do the same treatment, cutting it into small chunks and putting that also on a tray lined with parchment paper so that we can freeze both of these for roughly 15 minutes until they're about 80% frozen the way through, because we are going to turn that into freshly ground meat. Now, one thing about Hamburg steak or Salisbury steak is that it's usually quite saucy, which means it pairs perfectly well with rice. And being that this is a Japanese inspired dish, I usually see a bowl of rice accompanying this kind of thing, which makes a lot of sense. So this is just some really good rice. Make sure to rinse it out until the water is clear and cook it in your local rice cooker until it is cooked. Now, if you haven't watched the anime, there's a lot of scenes that makes you go, hey, who's cutting onions up there? The answer is me. I'm the one cutting onions because we're gonna need them to make the steak. I'm gonna take a handful of onions there, chop them up pretty roughly. They don't need to be too small, but we don't want large, massive chunks of onion here until we all chopped up the onions. And I am in the same state as I was as watching the first couple episodes of Frieren. If the phrase garden of blue flowers means anything to anybody, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so probably one of the most important part about a Hamburg steak is the sauce. The sauce kind of ties everything together and makes the ground or cheap meat kind of extra delicious. In this case, we're gonna make a demi-glace inspired sauce. So we have 2 cans of these little kind of pre-made demi-glace bases that we're gonna go ahead and throw into a sauce pot over medium heat. And I'm gonna add in a healthy glug of red wine, probably about 2 cups or so, followed by a half cup of ketchup, 1/4 cup of butter, and some salt and sugar, just for some extra flavor. This is just going to simmer down until it is nice and somewhat reduced, but not too thin or not too thick. I want this to coat the back of a spoon a little thicker than what people usually say. That's how I usually know that it is ready. Keep in mind this will also thicken as it cools. Alright, the next thing is to grind the meat in a food processor until you have made freshly ground meat. Now the trick to this is make sure that the meat is pretty much 80% of the way frozen and work in small batches. Otherwise, if it's too large, you might kind of get these tendons or, silver skins and fat kind of stuck to the blade, and it kind of creates this weird like sponge-like sound when the food processor is mixing. We want this to grind down the meat. So working slowly one batch at a time, we're going to go ahead and make sure that all of the pork is first processed and then move on and process all of the beef. This took about 6 batches in total, and at the result we have beautifully freshly ground, pebbly textured ground meat, which I think is far superior of a method compared to the typical KitchenAid grinder meat attachment kind of thing, and is superior to buying freshly ground pork and beef at the grocery store, because this one I think has a lot more interesting of a texture. Also, similar to making meatballs or meatloaf, usually making a Hamburg steak requires the use of a panade, which is usually some sort of breadcrumb and milk hydrated. So in another mixing bowl, I'm going to crack in 6 eggs, whisk in 3/4 cup of milk, 2 cups of panko breadcrumbs, and some salt, just to make sure that we get this panade nice and hydrated before adding that into our meat mixtures, along with the onions that we cut up earlier. Rachel's going to help me season this with a little bit more salt, because usually with this amount of meat, you do need a good amount of seasoning. Once our giant meat mixture has been mixed together thoroughly and everything had time to hang out with each other, now we're going to pan fry the whole thing in a very large skillet with a good amount of vegetable oil to hopefully prevent sticking. I'm cooking this on a medium-high heat. Honestly, Frieren cooked it over an open flame in the show, but we kind of have this stove here, so I'm trying to figure out how to cook this in the best way. After a couple of minutes where I see the sides are starting to brown a little bit, let's go ahead and try to get under this whole thing and flip it. Okay, definitely some charred bits there, maybe because the heating element is a little bit uneven, and yeah, gotta make sure we take off those black bits because we don't want those. So a little bit of cracks, little crumbles, I think that's fine. Also, that's a big reason why we have that gravy that we made earlier. That's gonna cover up a lot of the mistakes from this. It's okay. Alright, after realizing that we probably can't cook this all the way through purely on one surface of heat, I decided to throw this into the oven at about 325 degrees until the center of the meat reaches about 150 degrees, perfectly cooked. For us, that baked for roughly 20 minutes or so. Also, just gonna make a quick side salad here, as it is one of the elements in the show, so just cutting up a little bit of carrots, some lettuce, and a couple of cherry tomatoes to make a bowl of what is probably just mostly set dressing for the show. And also maybe, you know, if you want to be a little bit healthy, but I'm pretty sure the greatest warriors in the land didn't really care about the side salad as much as they cared about the meat. Okay, I'm gonna take our giant Hamburg steak out of the oven, flip this over onto a plate, and clean up any of those leftover meat crumbles that we have. Now that everything is a little bit tidier, I'm going to slowly distribute our demi-glace sauce from earlier evenly on top of the steak patty. This looks pretty good. Nice little glaze, and you can't really tell how many little cracks there were before. So once again, there's also utility in the visual aspect of having this sauce. Go ahead and serve this with a giant bowl of steaming freshly cooked rice along with our side salad. And yeah, this is our version of the giant warrior Hamburg steak from Frieren. It is not my birthday today, but I will gladly indulge in this as if it was. Taking a cut in the corner, this is super delicious. It's not dry at all, the onion flavors are there, and the sauce really makes a nice combating acidity to the fattiness of the meat that we had. Honestly, in some ways I do prefer this over actual steak, which is kind of a cool thing because this probably cost a fraction of the price to make. Now there is quite a lot of this, and I'm not as large of a warrior as Stark is, so I'm going to need some help. We got Tony here, we got Rachel here to also come in and eat some. We all agreed that this was one of those dishes that just is really good. And if you take a chunk and serve it over rice, this is akin to what you might get in a lunch shop in Japan. Alright, so clearly there's a lot of leftovers. We tried to pack home as much as we can, you know, for everybody in the studio to take some. I definitely took some home. But what happens the next day when you have a cold piece of Hamburg steak and some cold leftover rice? What do? Do you warm it up? Yeah, you can, but I decided to give this leftover a bit of a makeover. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take a chunk of this Hamburg steak and just chop that into small bits. Doesn't have to be super accurate. And now we're gonna go ahead and take a wok and crack in about 4 to 5 eggs in some hot oil because we are going to be making fried rice. That is one of my favorite ways to repurpose almost any leftover you have in the fridge. Now the thing about this is that if you've seen me cook rice before for fried rice, I like to make it a certain way. I'm actually pan frying these eggs until they are crispy, not fluffy and not soft. So I'm actually overcooking them to the point where almost all of the moisture comes out and the yolk and the white have started to become brown, breaking them up constantly to get these little crispy egg bits. So they are the opposite of soft. They are crispy because I think that gives the eggs a much more deeper flavor that imparts its aroma into the rice and whatever you're cooking with it. So once that's all looking good, we're going to kind of cool down the temperature of the wok by adding in our chopped hamburger mixture from earlier. That's going to sizzle nicely. All of the fats inside from the hamburger mixture are going to start to melt and brown, and just everything's going to start tasting and smelling really good and get crispy, not wet. While those are stir frying, I'm going to slice a couple of scallions because scallions always add a nice burst of color and acidity to this dish. Then, after seasoning this with salt, I'm going to add in our quote-unquote leftover rice that we've had pad, ideally storing in the fridge on a single layer to dry out. But you can also do this with fresh rice, it's totally fine. And after stir frying for quite some time, I like to make sure to cook my fried rice pretty long to get as much moisture out as possible. And now present to you the Giant Warrior Hamburg steak leftover fried rice, which is crispy, it's eggy, it's delicious. The meat has caramelized and browned nicely. Everything is crunchy, and the scallions kind of combat everything by bringing it down a notch. I honestly think in many ways this tastes almost more delicious than the original dish itself. But honestly, if there's anything to take away is that no matter what you have left over, as long as you have eggs, rice, scallions, you can turn any sort of leftover into a delicious dish, as long as it's not a dessert. That would be weird. Anyway, I think this is the kind of dish that Himmel would be proud of, and maybe one day I'll be able to serve it to him. This episode is sponsored by Bombas, aka the world's most comfortable socks. And while they are comfy, the best part is that for each item purchased, one is donated. They've donated over 100 million articles of clothing so far across all 50 states. So you're not just getting your new favorite pair of socks, you're helping Bombas donate some to someone else too. Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good. New customers get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/Babish and use code Babish20 at checkout.